Bon dia, buenos dias, good morning. My name is Brian Pitts, and I am the Assistant Director of the Latin American Institute here at the University of California, Los Angeles. Well, here in my own room and not actually at UCLA, but the screen background looks great. So today we have a really exciting panel on the effects of the implications of the United States presidential election in Latin America. This week, estadounidenses, whatever their political views, are united in their common apprehension about the upcoming presidential election. And despite our political polarization, there's broad agreements about what the stakes are. Issues like racial justice, the Supreme Court, healthcare, and the future of legalized abortion are seen on both the right and the left as key issues, and differences between the two candidates are clear. But of course, elections in the world's richest country with its most powerful military don't just matter north of the Rio Grande and south of the 49th parallel. They matter to Europe, they matter to the Middle East, they matter to Africa, and as we will see today, they matter a great deal to Latin America. Latin America is the world region that has historically attracted the most attention from the United States. From the Monroe Doctrine to contemporary efforts to promote regime change in Venezuela, the United States has seen Latin America as its backyard. Latin Americans, for their parts, have generally resented what they see as unwelcome meddling in their internal affairs. Thus, the stakes in this election are very different for Latin Americans than to North Americans, and sometimes perhaps the differences between the two candidates aren't as clear when it comes to their policy on Latin America. So that's what our speakers will talk about today. This event has been co-sponsored by the Center for Brazilian Studies, the Center for Mexican Studies, the Center for Southern Cone Studies, and the Program in Caribbean Studies here at UCLA, all of which are affiliated with the Latin American Institute. Each speaker will be introduced by the director of the center that invited them. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Veronica Cortines of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, who will introduce our first speaker. Professor Cortines, you are going to need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you very much, Brian. I would like to welcome everybody, of course, all the panelists and all the people who are listening, and particularly Professor Claudia Hayes from Chile, one of our leading political scientists there. To make a very brief introduction, Professor Hayes first got her journalism degree at the Universidad de Chile, then got an MA from Columbia University in New York under the auspices of a Fulbright, where she also in New York, she worked at the United Nations. She then got the PhD in political science at the New School for Social Research. She currently teaches at the Institute of Public Affairs at the Universidad de Chile, where she is also the head of the political science area. She has, most importantly, written extensively on the Chilean Constitution of 1980, drafted first originally under the Pinochet dictatorship, which was categorically defeated in Sunday historic plebiscite in Chile, which has everybody in the country very happy. And I think it's very fitting to leave this part, since the Pinochet dictatorship, as everybody knows, was not only strongly supported by the US government, but also highly financed by it. So it's a very great pleasure to have you with us, Professor Hayes, and I really look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much to the Latin American Institute at UCLA, and to Brian Pitts and Professor Cortines for inviting me. As you mentioned, we are in a very crucial political moment, critical juncture perhaps in Chilean politics, and this will no doubt affect also the relationship with the United States, whoever wins in November. I think one aspect that will influence Chile's relationship to the US will be the development of the constitution-making process, how things evolve from this point onwards, because we have a 2-year period of uncertainty, probably social mobilization will continue, and we will have intense, many elections. And the other aspect that will be very influential, I think, is our presidential election in November next year. So in 1 year from now, so this year we will have President Piñera, who is ideologically closer to President Trump, But in 1 year, we will have another, and President Piñera is deeply weakened by, I think, the process that we are living since the social outburst of October 18. But we will have another president in November, elected in November 2021. So that also will influence how things work between Chile and the US presidency, whoever wins the November 3rd election. The campaigns of Biden and Trump, of course, have very different positions on foreign policy and on Latin America. I think a year ago we saw a very bad handling of foreign policy by the American government, but some internal successes, particularly in the economic area. At the same time, the Democrats had an advantage in the midterms in 2018. Unemployment was low, below 4%, and Trump has had all the political problems with the Russian involvement in politics and the impeachment, which he succeeded to avoid. But today, I think the probability of Joe Biden winning this election is very high. And he will have to face, if he wins, a problem that will also influence foreign relations, which is the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. So COVID-19 has been very badly handled by, I think, the US government, and also very badly handled by the Chilean government. In Chile, we had, I think, in the beginning, a similar approach, not as vocal perhaps as Trump or Bolsonaro, but with a underneath idea of, ¿cómo se dice? De manada, herd contagion, the idea that the main goal was not to stop the economy, not to paralyze the economy. And so if some people had to get sick, you just have to let them get sick, and probably they would develop resistance to the virus, which it did not happen. And so I think the way the pandemic has been handled in the US is in a way similar to Chile and to Brazil, with very bad results, of course, in the three countries. So Biden would have to deal with that, and also a new Chilean government would have to deal with the economic consequences of the pandemic. And probably an even deeper financial crisis than the one Obama had to face in 2009. And in Chile, we have had lower growth in the last 5 years. So the social outburst of October 18 started after around 5 years of slower growing economy, and economy growing at 2%, whereas in the 5 years before we had been growing at 4%. But now we're going to see a drop, a contraction of the economy with negative numbers. So this is going to be a much harsher crisis than the one that Chile was experiencing before the social outburst of October 18. So I think that the difference between an American, Trump triumph and a Biden triumph with regard to the Southern Cone, but especially Chile, has consequences in two main areas. One is, of course, migration. I think this is the most complex subject for in a context of economic crisis. And Trump, of course, wants to cut migration and has had a very sharp combat to Latin American migrants, whereas Biden would probably focus more on hemispheric cooperation in problems that have caused, in facing the causes of the Central American, in particularly, and Mexican exodus to the US. But Biden would probably have an agenda more focused on cooperation, on human rights, the environment, the corruption, and taking over the role that the US had when he was vice president in the Obama government, where they tried to play a role more like an articulation role within the region in Latin America. So probably Biden would not follow this aggressive policy with the wall, and would try to play a more friendly role as with the refugee seekers and migrants. but of course, migration would still be fought, but with different mechanisms and probably with more cooperation to avoid the roots and the causes of it. And so that would lead to an emphasis in probably cooperation on poverty, unemployment, access to education in Latin America, which I think would benefit the region in general. And the second aspect is the capacity to create political agreements. The US has been very, well, of course, unilateral. The appointment of authorities without consulting anybody in ways that are not usual for foreign policy have been somewhat shocking for the region. And so I think what I mentioned before, who wins the next election in Chile will determine how the relationship between the US and the Chilean government will play with that respect. I don't think the basic commercial positions of the relationship between Chile and the US would change much, but I do think that the constitution-making process that Chile is living may mean a certain turn left, to use an old expression, in Chile, with more affinity towards a Democrat in the presidency, and of course it will depend who wins the next presidential election. Although the social movements in Chile that push this constitution-making process demand more social rights-oriented policies. At the same time, the figure that has more possibilities to win a next presidential election is from the right, is Joaquin Lavín, who is a right-wing person that has not wanted to define himself ideologically too much, that did not say he was against changing the constitution, because 80% of Chileans want to change the constitution, so he's being ambiguous about that. But of course, he was a supporter of Pinochet, and he was a strong defender of the economic model. So if Lavín wins, that would make him more closer to, I think, Trump than to Biden, really. But I think he would be able to have good relationships with both. Whereas if a more left-wing candidate wins, the situation could be different. And of course, then the affinity towards Biden would be much greater and would make easier the relationship. And a last point I wanted to make is the role of the policy towards Venezuela. Venezuela has a strong impact in Chilean politics because, first of all, we have many Venezuelan immigrants, and second, it has a very important symbolic role, Venezuelan politics in Chile, particularly with regard to constitution making. Venezuela has been used internally in Chilean politics as a warn from the right towards the dangers of changing the constitution, and saying that the campaign of the right wing warning against constitution-making process talked about Chilezuela, that Chile was going to become Venezuela, and with all the disasters that Venezuelan politics has created. And so that has been a threat to the citizens not to change the constitution, and used as a defense of the Pinochet constitution. But of course, that was not powerful enough to change the result of the plebiscite. And so I think that the policy towards Venezuela brings Trump closer to Piñera. We saw in the beginning of the Piñera government, before all the problems he has faced, an attempt to have some kind of regional leadership by Piñera that brought him close to Trump and to intervene in Venezuelan politics. That the role of Venezuela, as I said, would make a Biden government who would probably focus more on multilateral action against the Maduro government, would make that closer to a left-wing or a center-left Chilean government would work better with a Biden government with regard to that issue as well. So that's all I wanted to say.
Brian, can we transition into the next segment? So I'm assuming then.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, right. So I was waiting for your cue. My name is José Luis Passos. I direct the Center for Brazilian Studies here at UCLA. And let me start by thanking Brian for organizing this webinar, which is so interesting and timely. So on behalf of Kevin Terrasiano, director of the Latin American Institute, I would like to welcome our Center for Brazilian Studies guest speaker, Professor Marco Sepicki. I have been following and reading Marco Sepicki for a number of years now. We haven't, we've never actually met, and thanks to another upcoming guest speaker, Claudio Machado, he finally put us in touch. And Professor Marco Sepicki is a full professor of international relations and comparative politics at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. He has been a visiting scholar at the University of Denver, Renmin University in Beijing, University of Oxford, the Naval Postgraduate School here in Monterey, California, and the ISRI in Mozambique, in addition to Indiana University and the Flaxo in Ecuador. Since 1995, he has authored or edited 11 books, 45 book chapters, and over 40 scientific articles. Since 2003, Professor Sepicki has coordinated 19 research projects funded by national and international grants, conducting fieldwork in the United States, Great Britain, Colombia, Argentina, Ecuador, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, India, and China. It's a very impressive resume, and someone I've been following to learn more about contemporary politics and Brazil in the global context. So welcome, Sepicki. It's great to have you on board.
Thank you very much, José Luis, and thank you, Brian. I congratulate the Latin American Institute and the Center for Brazilian Studies for this initiative. Of course, everyone in the world is watching the elections in the United States, and not many in Brazil realize that it's not only a presidential election, but actually the stakes are much higher than that, because not only you have state level elections, some municipal and mayoral elections, various referenda, Native American leaders being selected, and the results of these elections are not only being meaningful for the United States for the years to come in the judiciary, in the restricting policies, but also for the rest of the world and for our region as well. As you know, Brazil is the ugly bully in the neighborhood, right, these days, and so it will be very important for the Brazilian politics and the Brazilian economy, the results. But in order to grasp the differences, we also need to look at a little bit at the recent history and compare what difference Trump made for a Trump government made for the Brazilian economy, because of this so-called alliance between the Bolsonaro government and Trump. One would expect that the economic results would be positive. There was a commercial gain, diplomatic convergence, cooperation should have enhanced during this period. And I will spare you from the PowerPoint, as Professor Cortines asked, but I have some data that can corroborate what I'm about to say. That is, it was good for America. It was good for Trump's government to have a so-called ally, and in the Brazilian government these days. The exports from United States to Brazil increased during the Trump years, but the Brazilian export to the United States and American foreign direct investment in Brazil actually suffered from this alliance. We have losses, significant losses in terms of our economic position regarding the United States during this period. Diplomatic relations were not significantly affected at least positively affected in this case. There was a lot of presidential and ministerial visits from Brazil to the United States, but not the other way around. Actually, Trump treated Bolsonaro as a sort of a servant, and it was Bolsonaro was given peanuts for all the efforts he made. So this alliance was boosted by Bolsonaro internally in Brazil, but not actually resulted in Brazilian gains in any sort. And to be so subservient to Trump also decreased the Brazilian importance in the region significantly. Brazil is a threat for its neighbors, and Brazil is not respected by its neighbors anymore. We allowed Mike Pompeo to come to Brazil to not only engage in trying to destabilize a neighboring country, but we actually supported Trump's policies regarding Venezuela and Bolivia. We withdrew our candidacy to IDP presidency. The numbers of economic loss can be quantified by additional tariffs to steel and aluminum, and also to the amount of chloroquine that we bought from the United States, 2 million doses that are sitting in the Brazilian Ministry of Health, waiting for Bolsonarists to come and get shots and doses for that. I think the two main points here are the economic losses, the reputational losses, and also some material losses that are not measured in numbers but are important. We seized a Alcantara space launch base for the United States to use, and we have abdicated from the differential treatment at World Trade Organization without any significant gains in terms of reciprocity in diplomatic or economic terms. So I agree with Professor Claudia Weiss that the stakes are high if Biden wins, which is far from being secured right now. I don't know if it's the 2016 surprise that makes me being very careful and look carefully to my old living. I lived in Pennsylvania for a while, and I know that will be a tough cookie for this next week election. So, but I agree with Professor Eyes that environment, migration, commerce, foreign direct investment, bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, and of course China will be the main points here to look. I'm a little bit more skeptical and pessimistic about Biden being less aggressive in Latin America. We had a very bad experience with the Department of Justice and the car wash operation during the Obama government, and Hillary Clinton was no friend from, and part of the Democrats were unable to distinguish Venezuelans from Chileans, from Brazilians, from Argentinians. They don't have the, of course, they are not so ignorant or opportunistic as Trump, because for Trump, Latin America begins in Miami and ends in San Diego. And have no interest or knowledge of whatsoever about what's actually going on down here. But the Democrats, they may try to compensate for the rhetorical exaggerations from Trump, but not actually refrain from being a moral interventionist in the region. And some of this will be for Brazil's gain, and some of this may be for the Brazilian's loss. And I will point out finally to wrap this up, for topics, and to see. The first topic is 5G. Brazil has postponed the participation of China in the 5G, attending pressures from United States. And from my point of view, the Democrats and Biden will have to continue this with less less tones of aggression, but we will have to continue this irrational politics to China. And that will also have implications for Brazil as well, because as you may know, China is the Brazilian biggest commercial partner and a very important investor and provider of foreign direct investment in Brazil right now. So Brazil is expecting to have an economic decline of more than 5 percentage points this year. So we are looking to the ways to recover from this, but it will take years from now. We have been in economic slowdown for quite some time, and the social crisis has been aggravated before the pandemics, and 5G is an important topic of the future relations between Brazil and China, and I think the US position, no matter Trump or Biden, will be significantly negative for Brazil in that regard because of the pressures. The second topic is climate change in the Amazon region, and of course Bolsonaro was instrumental to increase the Amazon deforestation and was very supportive of Trump withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and I think it will be positive for the Brazilians and for the world and for the Amazon region if the American government, an American government led by Biden, if it pressures Brazil to a little bit to comply with decent climate and environmental policies. That will be contagions in the relationship between a Bolsonaro government and a Biden government, but I think that pressure would be for the Brazilians' gain. Of course, COVID-19 is a sort of water division topic, and there is only one. I think with Bolsonaro, Trump, and Modi in India are competing for the worst of the worst in the world, but Brazil is terrible in that regard, and I think a Biden government would change that greatly, at least in the United States, hopefully for the world, going back to the World Organization and to some rational policy regarding the health and how to deal with the pandemic. And so one is negative, 5G, two are positive if more pressure from the United States come, climate change and COVID. And the last one, it will depend on where you sit in the Brazilian politics. Anti-corruption discourse, the sort of moral interventionism that we can expect from Biden, and the use of anti-corruption measures to manipulate politics, I think will continue, and it will be very, very divisive in Latin America in general, and especially in Brazil these days, because the car wash operation has lost some of the appeal to the population, and it's not a successful story anymore. So whatever pressure or support comes from the United States, it will be divisive in the country in the next years. So these four topics, I think, are maybe regarded as uncertainties, and they add to the uncertainty of the election results in the United States, and hopefully the change will be for the better, not the worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cepicki.
Okay, next we're going to take a big jump to the north to nuestro vecino Mexico. And so I'm going to hand it over to Professor Ruben Hernandez Leon of our Department of Sociology and Director of our Center for Mexican Studies. Oh, and just one thing too, those of you who are viewing on via Zoom, we do have a Q&A function you'll see at the bottom of the screen just below whoever's speaking. You can submit questions there anytime, and they will be addressed at the after all four panelists have presented. Take it away, Professor Hernandez Leon.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for organizing this event. And thank you, everybody, participants and colleagues of the directors of the different centers. As Brian mentioned, I'm Rubén Hernandez León, professor of sociology and director of the Center for Mexican Studies. And it's my distinct pleasure today to welcome Dr. Alejandro Diaz Dominguez, who is a professor and researcher at the School of Government and Public Transformation at Tec de Monterrey in the Mexico City campus. He conducted his undergraduate studies at ITAM in political science in Mexico City, and he received his PhD in political science from Vanderbilt University. He has conducted extensive research in a number of very interesting areas and topics, including religion and politics in Mexico, political economy, and the vote and electoral processes. And most recently has been working on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in Mexico, and trying to assess and use different methodological strategies to actually gauge the impact of the pandemic. So Alejandro, we might have to bring you back on that particular topic. But for now, we want to welcome you and thank you for being here with us. Take it away, Alejandro.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone. Thanks, Professor Rubén Hernandez. Thank you so much, Brian and UCLA, for this invitation. I just want to show you a very short presentation with some graphs trying to explain this idea about what Mexican people think about the US elections. Essentially, we want to divide Mexican people in two main groups. The first one is the digital one, and the second one is the society at large. In the digital part, we see these connected information seekers. I will show you some evidence about that. And in Twitter, we have this conversation about the US elections. So it's the first part. The second part, I will take some minutes to talk about the society at large, in which we find a distinction between our president and the US president for the people, and the relationships between governments and the people, and trust in the US government, and of course, the interest that people in Mexico had about the US elections. So essentially, I'm here showing you those Google search webs during the last 15 years. In green, you will see the Pope, just to compare with one important personality in a very Catholic country. So we have in red our president, López Obrador, and then we have in blue the US President, Donald Trump. As you can see, for AMLO's victory in 2019, we have more interest here, but in 2016, we have this very important peak regarding Trump. Now we have more interest in the US elections, as you can see, and the Pope is just a comparison, right? Regarding news, we have essentially pretty much the same. We have a huge interest in AMLO's victory, the electoral landslide victory in 2018. But again, we have a very important peak here with the election in 2016 in the US. And now we have a slightly more interest people on the US elections these days. Regarding Twitter, the conversations in Twitter, these conversations revolve around trending topics. Regarding the US election, we have Trump, Biden, and the debates, and how it's important for us, this idea about the re-election, about who is the winner of the debate, and all these specific words that we see in this word cloud that I made 2 days ago. And it's important to see this uncomfortable word term here, right? I mean, incómodo, which means uncomfortable. That's important for us because it's not very easy for us to see another term for President Trump. So This is the first part. The second part is what people think. It's important to see what people think. So I'm using 3 surveys here. I will use Reforma, I will use LAPOP, and I will use El Financiero. So for Reforma survey in July this year, do you remember this visit that the AMLO's government it made to Trump's administration? So the question is, who benefits the most for this visit? And according to people, well, Trump, essentially 48%. But who is the best for Mexico, Biden or Trump? Overwhelmingly, 79% of people think, well, Biden will be a better option for us. But still, is it July? And then we're going to show now. So we expect more respect for Trump after this visit. Yes, almost 1/2, but 42% say, well, no, maybe not. So do you support this visit? Yeah, 64%, they supported the visit. And do you think that the relationship between AMLO and Trump is something based on respect or subjection? And it's interesting to see that people identify respect 58%. So there is an important difference between how people perceive the relationship between leaders. Now, I will change to LAPOP surveys. In these surveys, for the last 4 waves, we ask the levels of trust in the US government in Mexico. As you can see, 1/2 of people, they trust in the US government during the Obama's administration. And then 2014, pretty much the same. But after Trump's victory in 2016, we see an important change, the untrust. The untrust is 78%. The untrust now is 74%, 3/4. It's a lot. So there is a change. And it's important to see this because there is a distinction, I argue, between how people see the relationship between 2 leaders and how people perceive the relationship between the government and the people. So that's an important distinction. It's not because we distrust the US per se. No, it's not because of that. It's because there are reasons such as the type of specific leaders, the type of specific states of exercising leadership. And finally, I want to show you the interest in the US elections among the Mexican people. There are fun surveys almost 1 year ago. As you can see, not much interest. 1/3 is interested in the election in August 2019, but now it's 46%. So we have more interest in the election when compared to July, actually, 15, 16 points more of people are interested. And those who are not interested, well, this is declining. This red line suggests a decline, a clear decline. So it's important to see that this is changing. Our interest in the US election is clearly there. It's not like the first election in 2016, but it's important to know that we are interested in the election among the elites, if you will, and among the people. And finally, the question that you want to ask, right? So how Mexico see the election? Who is leading the election? At the very beginnings of the pandemic, was unclear, but still Trump was, in the perception of Mexicans, was leading the election. As you can see, 1/2 of people, they don't really know what's going on. Our responses here are 1/2 of the survey. And time goes on, and then we are here. In September, of course, we have just 1/3 of no responses. Here we have 1/2, and here we have 1/3 of no responses, which suggests that maybe there are interests in the US election, and now we see a change. More people think that Biden will win the election, which is, according to the surveys, maybe possible. Maybe it's possible. And finally, to conclude, I just want to say that, well, we are more interested in the US elections more than 3 months ago, but less than 4 years ago. There are differences between specific leaders and trust in general in the government and the US government, which is important, because typically the literature says, well, Mexicans are plenty of distrust of the other governments, but well, there are reasons to divide this explanation. And finally, when more information is available, we have more opinions, obviously. And expectations, well, we tend to believe that Democrats could win the popular vote. At least, I don't want to say anything else, but at least the popular vote seems to me like very clear. And we don't really know exactly the electoral college, but we tend to believe the popular vote for sure. And now, AMLO's government should adjust, because in that visit, the July visit, at that time, my intuition is that the Mexico's government, they really didn't know that Trump could lose. They don't have this idea, because as you can see here among the public, was unclear who was leading the race. No? And so it's among the people, and arguably among the elites was unclear as well. So that's the big picture about what Mexicans think about the US election. Well, thanks so much for your time.
All right, thank you so much. Now we're going to pass it along to Professor Jorge Martorano, who is the director of our program in Caribbean Studies and also professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, who will introduce our final speaker. Jorge, you need to unmute yourself. There we go. Oh, still not unmuted. Try again.
It's my mouse. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Brian, for organizing this event, and to Professor Kevin Terraciano, the director of the Latin American Institute. And of course, thank you for all the panelists.
Jorge, Brian, can you change the screen? Because it's still with the PowerPoint. So that we can see everything.
It shouldn't be.
Yeah,
I'm not seeing the PowerPoint.
No, I see Jorge, but only Jorge.
That's what you're supposed to see.
If you can go back to the way we had it originally, that would be wonderful.
Well, so this is, we're seeing Jorge and Jorge speaking, so.
Yeah.
No, I mean.
Okay, and I want to thank also to Professor Cesar Ayala, who gave me the contact, of Professor Renato Santiago. For me, it's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Charles Renato Santiago, who is a PhD in political science from the University of Massachusetts, and is professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and El Institute for Latina, Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies at the University of Connecticut. He's also an affiliate faculty in the Asian American Studies Institute and the American Studies Program. He has been the president of the Puerto Rican Studies Association and a steering committee board member of the Latina Critical Theory Organization. Professor Renato Santiago teaches courses in the public law, Latin American politics, and political theory. Professor Renato Santiago has published widely on topics that include the relationship between the US and the Caribbean, US territorial legal history, the history of US citizenship for Puerto Rico, the projection of the US global empire, the history of Puerto Rican political status, the relationship between law and nation-state building in the Americas, the US territorial citizenship and status law and policy, among others, that also include questions of constitutional law, race and ethnicity, and criminal justice. He has published a number of books, including Hostage of Empire, A Short History of the Extension of the US Citizenship to Puerto Rico, 1898 to the present, Puerto Rico and the Origin of the US Global Empire, The Disembodied Shade, and with Barry Glick and William Sturgeon, No Time to Play, Just Full Offenders in Adult Correctional System. He has been the editor of several journal issues, such as the one in Centro Journal devoted to Puerto Rico post-Maria, Origin and Consequences of a Crisis, and the one centered on US citizenship in Puerto Rico 100 years after the Jones Act, in 2019 and 2017 respectively. He has directed several web-based databases and projects I highly recommend, such as the Puerto Rico Citizen Archives, the Puerto Rican in Connecticut Digital Project, and the American Samoa Nationality and Citizenship Archive Project. Professor Renato Santiago has also a powerful presence in public media, so if you think you have already read him or listened to him, you surely did in the Huffington Post, the Chicago Public Media, Morning Edition, and other NPR branches. Thank you very much, and welcome to Professor Renato Santiago.
Thank you for a wonderful, undeserved introduction. Okay, so I was thinking about this presentation earlier because as I was seeing all the other PowerPoints, it sounded to me that folks in Latin America are more interested in US elections than folks in Puerto Rico, which are more directly impacted in every election. And it's ironic because I was trying to think about local surveys and polls, and they don't really talk about Puerto Ricans in the island who think about US elections. They talk about local elections and the status implication. So part of what I was asked was to sort of figure out a little bit, what's the impact of the elections on Puerto Rico, and how can we think about that? I'm going to switch to a little bit of a PowerPoint on the suggestion of Jorge, because it might be easier to clarify a few points. I'm not going to discuss the whole thing, but perhaps this might clarify some starting points for a longer conversation after the talk. So let me switch here briefly, if you don't mind. I'm hoping that, can folks see this okay? Okay, so let me talk a little bit briefly about clarifying the status of Puerto Rico, because that's what's going, in my opinion, what's going to clarify the subsequent debates. But the United States, since its founding, acquired sufficient territory, including a large portion of Mexico, and at one point parts of Central America, and at one point it sought to acquire Chile, to sort of build 37 states in the United States. And between the founding in 1789 and 1898, all territories that were actually annexed became states of the Union, 37 states in total, including later Hawaii and Alaska. The United States, between 1898 and 1901, begins to build a sort of global empire, and acquires Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, and decides to invent a new territorial status, one that gives it flexibility to essentially do a whole range of different things around the world, and without binding the United States Congress or other federal agencies to grant statehood to Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines. And I want to introduce this issue quickly because if you look at US foreign policy, for example, in the War on Terror, and you look at the footnotes in the War on Terror, they're all hinged to the cases that define the status of Puerto Rico: the creation of Guantanamo, torture, kidnapping, extrajudicial executions, and so on and so forth. They all end up in the insular cases as a constitutional justification for engaging in a certain type of foreign policy that violates basic civil and human rights. But we can talk about that later. What's important about the case of Puerto Rico is that the invention of this new territorial status essentially grants the United States the power to treat Puerto Rico like a foreign country when it wants to treat it, foreign in a domestic or for constitutional purposes. It also grants it the ability to discriminate, to create a separate and unequal territory, so long as it recognizes basic fundamental civil rights. And it also gives the United States a power to enact legislation that can essentially give Puerto Rico different kinds of benefits or statuses depending on what issue is important for Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico can be treated like a state, like an independent country. It can be treated like a territory, or it can be treated as something else. Now, in 1922, and we're reaching the centennial, the Supreme Court essentially said, this is going to be the status of Puerto Rico until Congress enacts specific legislation or explicit legislation changing the status of Puerto Rico. So for 122 years, Puerto Rico has essentially remained an unincorporated territory. There has been no effort by Congress to change the territorial status of Puerto Rico. So to that extent, the implications of the elections in Puerto Rico are really important, because the federal elections, the implications of Puerto Rico are important because they can determine whether Puerto Rico's status could change or not. Again, there are certain problems with this claim. Alejo, there are certain claims with this question of the status, because it has other implications in the United States, and I want to say something about that in 1 second. Okay. So the first question that comes up on a regular basis is, what's going to happen with the status of Puerto Rico should one of these candidates win? Puerto Rico has celebrated 5 status plebiscites. No political party has achieved more than 50% of the electorate in support of any one position. Generally speaking, the statehood party garners about 48% of the electorate. At most, in the last couple plebiscites, we've seen a lower number of electors voting. In the 2017 plebiscite, only 22% of the electorate voted, or 23% of the electorate voted. Likewise, Congress has debated the question of status of Puerto Rico in 100 different bills since 1898, but has never committed to changing the status of Puerto Rico or enacting a binding bill that provides a plebiscite for Puerto Rico. Congress, in fact, has been silent on the question of the status of Puerto Rico for 122 years. Puerto Rico is slated to have a 6th local plebiscite not authorized by the US Congress and not authorized by the US government in this election. So in local politics, this is seen as a way to mobilize Puerto Rican electors to participate in the local elections, because there's a certain degree of exhaustion with the corruption that the statehood party, which has been in power for the past 4 years, has sort of demonstrated in the island. So the plebiscite is hoping to, the advocates of the plebiscite are hoping to mobilize electors to vote in the elections, particularly for the statehood party. Nothing will change. And the reason for that is very simple. Puerto Ricans, both in the island and in the mainland, generally vote around 60 to 65% for the Democratic Party, and about 20% tend to vote Republican. And the implications of a Puerto Rican statehood movement would mean that the Democrats would acquire 2 new Senate seats and 4 representatives in Congress, which should give the Democrats an edge. Culturally speaking, this would mean adding an additional star to the US flag, and that might be a very controversial thing right now, especially when you add a brown flag. States are also admitted a brown star to the flag, and especially when states are admitted in pairs, which would require Washington, D.C. to be the next candidate. Now, the Republicans have been very clear. They don't believe in statehood for Puerto Rico. They're not going to support it. And Democrats, until recently, began to advocate or began to concede the possibility of statehood for Puerto Rico, which is ironic because they stand to gain the most. Now, the other underlying problem, let me get this one, is the question of debt release. If Puerto Rico became a state, then it is possible to argue that the Puerto Rican debt, which hovers around $150 billion, and the legislation enacted to manage the local debt in Puerto Rico would become illegal or unconstitutional, because Puerto Rico becoming a state would acquire a sovereignty that would make congressional interference illegal. Likewise, that would happen if Puerto Rico ever decided to embrace independence. And the problem with that is that you have about 75%, or at least in earlier years, you had close to 75% of public pension plans in the mainland that were locked into the local debt in Puerto Rico. And that has strong implications for public employees who are relying on public pension plans. So to that extent, it is possible to argue that statehood or a change in status is just not in the map for any of the 2 political parties, because the implications would be enormous, not only for political purpose, but also for financial purposes in the public sector. Notwithstanding that the Democratic Party has supported both the idea of doing a bailout or paying for the debt, $150 billion or something along those lines, and also considering statehood for Puerto Rico. And this has been the first time in the history of the United States where the Democrats have actually, as a party, come out in defense of a political status change for Puerto Rico. They've been sort of fairly silent, at least for the past 70 or 80 years. There is another debate around the presidential vote, which more directly relates to this talk. And namely, the question is whether Puerto Ricans who are US citizens who are living in the island can participate in federal elections, particularly in the presidential vote. Now, as we know, the United States is not a democracy, so citizens don't actually vote. I mean, they vote, they participate in the process of voting. But in the United States, the Electoral College selects the president, and as Hillary Clinton can attest, you can win the popular vote, and that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you will acquire or that you will win the elections. It's going to depend on whether you can actually win the Electoral College. Now, in the case of Puerto Rico, in order to participate in presidential elections, Puerto Rico would need an Electoral College. And it could follow the example of Washington, D.C., which has an Electoral College and is not a state. But granting Puerto Rico an Electoral College would essentially defeat the purpose of statehood, or would affirm the possibility of statehood. In addition to that, when you look at local political participation, it's not clear that Puerto Ricans even care about participating in presidential elections. The best example of this is when you look at the Puerto Rican primaries or the presidential primaries in Puerto Rico. And again, Puerto Ricans can participate in federal presidential primaries. But, you know, on average, if you look at past voting practices, you may see 30, 40, 50,000 electors participating in presidential primaries when you have an electoral base of 2 million people, which suggests that historically voting for the president hasn't been a priority for a lot of individuals in Puerto Rico, a lot of voters. Let me offer, I have lots of issues that we can discuss in the question and answer, but let me offer one more piece, which is the question of parity funding. One of the concerns with this election is whether Puerto Rico will receive parity funding and welfare benefits. And this is really important because under the current status, the United States can discriminate against Puerto Rico downward or negatively, treat it like a state or treat it better than a state. And Puerto Rico could receive parity funding or equal funding through welfare plans. That could translate in billions of dollars for the local economy, which would bring Puerto Rico out of sort of this crisis. Democrats are supporting extending parity funding, which could mean billions of dollars, anywhere from 10 to $20 billion, depending on how you manage it. And Republicans have said, no, we want to get rid of federal funding. Why this is important? Because this is the simplest way to address the economic crisis in Puerto Rico and to address the effects of hurricanes and so on and so forth in the island. Okay, let me stop there. I think I'm running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Brian?
Gotta unmute myself. Thank you to all four of our speakers for really wonderful presentations. We'll go ahead and jump right into the Q&A. We can go until about another half hour if we need to, although, you know, with webinars, nobody ever minds getting out a little bit early, right? Watching in Zoom seems to be a lot more exhausting than watching in person. Our first question is for Alejandro, and asked, Roberto Gonzalez asked, what do you think would happen if Trump rejects the election results? Several media, including The Economist, have mentioned that Trump may reject the election results due to the mail-in ballots. What do you think the reaction to that would be in Mexico, I guess?
Yeah, we're familiar with this situation because we're always waiting for the Wednesday after the electoral day, in which we officially count the votes. So I guess that in this specific case, for this specific election, given the 64, 65 million voters in early votes, they have to wait. So in that regard, we are very familiar with waiting for the final results, not that night, not a specific Sunday night, but at the end, we have to wait for the official count. In that regard, I guess that Trump will wait until the last minute to accept, to concede or not. I guess that he will concede the electoral results. But I guess that the point is here from our experience that we are used to wait until the very end. 2006 was a very good example between Calderon and AMLO. We have 0.5% of distance between the first and the second place. It's a very, very, very tight election. So I guess that in this specific case, in the US, they have to wait until the official counting vote counting.
Okay, and we have several other questions, or one other question that's come up so far. Two questions have come up so far. Great. I have a question as well for, well, also once again for Alejandro. So you're up again. You can sit. This is from Brenda Giseli. Do you consider Latin America would have to modify certain actions or structures, la administración de COVID, climate change, and so on, if the Democratic Party wins the elections? So what ways, I guess, will Latin Americans have to adjust their own internal policies on these issues with the Democratic government? I think really this question could go for everyone and not just Alejandro.
Yes, exactly. In our case, for example, Senator Kamala Harris was very vocal about the problems about the TMEC or the US MEC, the new version of the Telecom, which is very different, because this specific version was not very green, according to her, which is part of truth. So we have to adjust, because if we believe that the new deal, the green one, have chances during the Biden's administration in that scenario, then in our country we have to adjust some policies, which is very difficult, because our government right now is preferring other alternatives such as oil and all the stuff. So it will be a very, very important debate if the Democrats win, of course.
Did anybody else want to jump in and add anything else to that? All right, next question then. And this is one that can really go to everybody. Stephanie asked if would there be any positive effects of a Trump re-election for Latin America?
No.
Can I add to that in the same direction? I think Trump, there are two two bad effects of a Trump re-election, at least from the Chilean perspective and from the Southern Cone. That would be first, the unpredictability of Trump. I think a Biden government would be more predictable, particularly in commercial, in the commercial sector. Perhaps less protectionist, but even taking that out of consideration, I think the problem in the commercial aspect with Trump is the unpredictability. I think it creates a sense of instability in the commercial relationship. And in the second place, I think Biden would not be forcing Latin American countries to choose all the time between China and the US. I think, as it was mentioned before about the 5G, I think this pressure probably would diminish and would be better for Latin America. And that, in addition to other considerations, I think would be two reasons to prefer Biden in the region.
Maybe if I could just add a little bit to that question with a specific issue. Both Los Angeles Times and the New York Times have reported that under a Biden administration, we could see a return to the focus of the United States on anti-corruption efforts in Latin America. There have been accusations made by very prominent people, including former President Lula, that the United States uses anti-corruption investigations in order to remove progressive governments. So if Biden is elected, should Luis Arce, Nicolás Maduro, the PT in Brazil, and Cristina Kirchner and Alberto Fernandez in Argentina be worried?
That's a very good question, Brian, and I think they should, because as we have seen during the Obama administration, it's difficult. I mean, there's two ways around. Brazilians in general, both the people and the elites, don't know how the political system works in the United States. They don't follow, they don't understand, they don't care. But the other way around is that one bad aspect of Trump administration was the destruction of the State Department and an increase in power of the South Command and crazy Republicans from Texas and Florida in determining the foreign policy towards the region. So I think it will take time for the State Department to rebuild some capacity to ponder political aspects of this anti-corruption crusade and consequence. And if it's left to the Department of Justice and the Homeland Security Department to conduct foreign policy towards Latin America in that regard, that would be a very bad outcome from Biden's election, in my opinion.
Shall we move on to the next question? We're having several questions appear right now. Oh, here's a good one. Diana Blanco asked how all of you think that border immigration policy, specifically family separation and detention, would change under a Biden presidency. And is this something being discussed in Latin America as something we could add to that? Anybody? Not to put Alejandro on the spot, but it's probably a question most relevant to Mexico.
Yes, exactly. We have this perception that Democrats will more inclined to to protect rights. However, during the Obama's administration, he was like a deporter in chief. We see the numbers. So during Biden's administration, I don't expect a real change regarding deportations. But of course, we have reasons to believe that the separating families and extracting, or separating kids from their parents, I hope that policy could essentially end. But regarding deportations and so on and so forth, this type of migration policies, I don't expect a real change when compared to Obama's days.
Charles?
Yeah, so in the Caribbean, I think immigration policy would change a little bit. I mean, part of the problem is that the sort of closing the borders has stemmed or slowed down Caribbean immigration. And because of remittances, Caribbean immigration is really important in Dominican Republic and Haiti and Cuba. And I think the Biden administration would open up because it has better relationships with some of the leaders, particularly in Dominican Republic and in other Caribbean countries, for more mobility of mobility that would open up for more remittances. Now, having said that, that also depends on COVID and whether COVID will enable opening borders. And it's not clear to me that that's going to change next spring or next summer for more mobility, independent of whether Democrats or Republicans win.
Brian, I have a question, two questions really. No, one is a follow-up on the question of China, no, because when we think on the investment of China in the region, no, we can see the case of Brazil, as Professor Cepik said, the case of Argentina, but also no, a big investment in the Caribbean. No? And when I say the Caribbean, I'm not thinking only in Cuba, no? Because there is a big project no, of a deep port in Jamaica, no, with commercial hubs, no, and in other parts of the Caribbean. So my question is, no, how do you think, no, that this will affect this project, and if an administration by Biden will try to entice the people who invest who or not go the way of China. See? Or what will happen in the region is what is happening in Africa, where the retraction of the US is giving a big space free to China. This is my first question. The second question has to do with Puerto Rico, and specifically the displacement caused by Maria. And if Charles thinks that this will have an impact in some parts of some states, like in Pennsylvania, where there was a kind of a movement, a displacement of Puerto Ricans from the island to Pennsylvania. Thank you.
So I'll say 2 points. China has been investing a ton of money in Puerto Rico lately and in Dominican Republic. It's and not just recently, but for a while now. So I don't see China going anywhere, even though there is an effort to sort of limit its power. In terms of the displacement of Puerto Ricans, so part of what it needs to be clear is that Puerto Rico has lost almost 1 million people since 2006 and 2007. Most Puerto Ricans who are US citizens at birth are traveling because there were no economic opportunities for particularly labor in the island. So they were relocating to the mainland. That was exacerbated because in 2016, Congress enacted an austerity law, or a law that imposed an austerity approach that essentially destroyed what was left of the local economy. And it's being sustained by about $20 billion that are coming every year through federal subsidies. What we do know, based on the US Census Bureau, a recent report that was released, is that Puerto Ricans, although they were migrating in large numbers to the mainland, are now returning to the island because they'd rather deal with the crisis in an environment where they have family members or they have a more safer environment than in the US, and it's warmer as winter approaches. So right after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, depending on what statistical source of evidence you look at, almost 155,000 people left the island automatically, but within 3 months, about 70,000 people had returned to the island. We saw another increase right after the hurricane, or right after that period in 2018 as a result of earthquakes. But because of the COVID contagion, we're seeing a lot more people returning back to the island, again, living in poverty. And depending on who you ask, the poverty rates range anywhere from 60 to 70% of the island. People living in poverty or at the edge of poverty in the island. But at least some people are arguing, and the US Census Bureau is confirming, that they have relatives that they can weather this storm in the island rather than in the mainland.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and move on to our next question. I'm going to jump to someone whose questions we haven't answered yet. Jane Ribbon Kurtzman asks, no one has addressed the issue of Cuba. Presumably Biden would attempt to reinstate Obama's efforts to improve US-Cuban relations. What changes do you envision regarding Cuba if Biden wins?
I would agree with that statement that there is and I know some people who are working in the Democratic side, that there would be a push for more openness and more migration. And given the economic crisis, for more efforts to export business, or at least US companies to Cuba, is what I'm hearing from behind the scenes. But again, everything's up in the air with COVID. So I'm not sure how much mobility we'll see in the next couple months, other than financial support or efforts to create more financial incentives in Cuba from the US. That's what I'm hearing from some colleagues.
May I add some comments? Just 2 comments, and they are related with Cuba and China as well. It will depend on the ability of Latin American countries to relaunch some sort of multilateral regionalism of sorts, due to the destruction of all multilateral frameworks that have existed in the previous decades. We now, not only in South America, but I mean, Caribbean and Central America are much better than South America in that regard. But I think CELAC and the China CELAC Forum would be very necessary to negotiate the new dependence on China in a better terms for the region. And in the case of Cuba, it's the same. I think it's up to Latin Americans to exercise some agency in terms of how far the next would be democratic administration can go in terms of rebuilding a sort of rational politics and policies towards Cuba.
Any other comments on that? Okay, well, here's a question that could be addressed to everyone, I think. Stephanie asked, would a Biden presidency make room for a progressive one in 2024, which is perhaps an American domestic politics question. But if that were to happen and a more to the left American governments were elected in 2024, how might US policy toward Latin America change? I think we don't know. Okay, Charles, go ahead.
And please correct me if I'm wrong, my colleagues, but since the Bush years, there's been a sort of disengagement in some ways with Latin America here in the United States, or at least that's my perception. Or strategically, of course, or Mexico, I think is an exception. Mexico, in the Caribbean. At the same time, when I look at the Obama administration, they weren't that friendly to progressives in Latin America, and Biden doesn't strike me as much more progressive than Obama. In fact, more center right. And Kamala Harris is not a progressive under any definition of that. I mean, just liberal, but she's not necessarily a right winger, but she's not that progressive in a Latin American context. So it's not clear to me that there's going to be a fundamental change in support of progressives if Biden comes into power. I think the irony for me is that if it were beneficial financially for Trump, he would likely support progressives in Latin America if he stands to gain something out of that personally, perhaps more so than Democrats, although I'm not seeing it right now. But that's just my reading of President Trump's public rhetoric, that he's just more interested in self-gain than in any kind of foreign policy, the coherent foreign policy. So I'm not sure that we'll see a support of progressives if the Biden administration comes in, unless it's practical. And again, under these circumstances, I hope to be corrected or stand corrected. I just don't see it. I didn't see it with the Obama administration. So I'm not sure the Biden administration offers something new.
It all depends on how the next president will govern in terms of the countrywide disputes that are going on. It depends on who is going to control the Senate and the profile of the new House members and some important state governments. One state government in the United States can make a huge difference in Latin America, and for the bad or the good. So I agree with Charles, but I would add this note of caution. We really need to focus on the legislative elections as well, and other disputes that are going on right now in the United States, especially in the judiciary.
Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any other questions from the audience. Did any of our center directors have any questions, or any of the panelists have questions for each other?
Veronica?
Okay, I think Professor Cortines has something. You'll want to unmute yourself first. There we go.
Yes, I would like Professor Hayes to distinguish between the countries of the Southern Cone and the way that a Biden administration would affect them very differently. Chile, say, Argentina, Uruguay. If you can comment on that, please.
Thank you. I think Chile has traditionally been closer to the US commercially, given that it was the first country to be associated through NAFTA, through the North American Free Trade Agreement. And whereas Argentina, Uruguay have been further away, focusing more on intra-regional commercial relationship with Mercosur, and so I think in that sense, perhaps a democratic government could bring closer that those countries that had not been. I don't think in the Chilean case it would be so much different, really, except for what I said before about the stability and the China issue. But I do think that a democratic government perhaps could get closer to those other countries that have been less engaged, maybe. There's something about if I could comment on the developments in Chile and the prospects for constitutional revolt. So the plebiscite. So I don't know if you mind that I take time commenting on that Marco and Alejandro are asking in the chat. Of course, I could go on and on about that. But I do think we are in a turning point in Chile since the October 18 outburst, and we are on the path to create a new constitution that started with the plebiscite this Sunday that gave a massive approval to the constitutional replacement, and this will lead, and I wonder how this will affect the relation with the US also. As I said before, it will be there are things to be that remain a question mark. Who will win the next presidential election, etc. How will this affect the balances in Congress? But the outburst in October 18 sent a very clear message, both against political elites and against the economic model, I think. And of course, that as was mentioned by Marco and by, I can't remember who else, by Jorge, I think. I think that could also, if Chile really makes a left turn, that could also perhaps be worrisome even for a democratic government in the US. I mean, it could sharpen the relation, make less smooth the relations between the US and Chile in the future, and particularly regarding free trade and other norms, because one of the big debates of the outburst and of the constitution movement is the relationship between private property and freedom of enterprise and public good. And in general, this constitution is so oriented to protect entrepreneurial freedom and the right to property, that when these kinds of rights enter into conflict with other rights, with the protection of the environment, or with the right to water, or with the right to health and education, the private interest always wins in that clash. And that's first because it is in the constitution that cannot be amended through majorities, because it's a constitution designed to protect to give veto power to the right, but also it's like that because of the way the constitution has been interpreted by the courts and by the Constitutional Tribunal. So in that sense, I do believe there is a certain level of uncertainty among foreign investors about what's going on in Chile, because if that balance changes, it remains to be seen how that will affect the entrepreneurial sector, and also probably the future policy, public policy on in the tax relationship, the tax structure in the future. I think the movement and the constitutional change are oriented to guarantee in a more robust way social rights, and that would need a change in the tax structure for sure. So I think it will of course affect Chile-US relationships. I don't know if in a very different way with Obama, with Trump, or with Biden. So, but it will have effects on foreign investment for sure. And of course, the constitutional debate we'd have to deal with questions like the autonomy of the central bank and other matters, economic matters that are very important for investment and for free trade. The convention cannot. The convention is extremely institutionalized. The whole constitutional process is regulated by a constitutional reform. And one of the articles of this reform, Article 135, states that the convention can only make a new constitution. It cannot take over other powers of the state, and also it cannot modify international treaties. It has to respect all the treaties signed already by Chile, and all judicial, ¿cómo se dice? Sentencias, judicial decisions by the judiciary cannot be modified. So it's extremely restricted and constrained constitution-making body that can only draft a new constitution and submit it to a plebiscite in June 2022, which is when the process will end and the constitution will be submitted to a new referendum with mandatory vote. But still, I mean, even though it's specifically stated that it cannot modify international treaties, I think there's still a certain levels of unease and of concern from foreign investors.
Thank you, Claudia.
So I think with that, we're about out of time. We have 3 minutes left, unless any of the panelists or center directors, program directors had any final thoughts. But if not, thank you so much to everyone for attending. It has been a great pleasure to have all 4 of our panelists with us to help refocus our gaze here in the United States on the effects that our elections have, not only for the 300 and however many million of us there are now, 330 million, but for the other 6.7 billion people around the rest of the world. So thank you so much for joining us. If you please visit the website of the Latin American Institute at international.ucla.edu/LAI to view our events calendar with all of our upcoming events. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to the directors of our centers, and thank all of you for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.